as well. As many of you are aware, we are live streaming the first hour of this webinar on LinkedIn and on YouTube. We will then close our virtual doors, if you like, and go into Q&A with the speakers just for our panel, just for our cohort companies. So we should have both our Asia Pacific cohort as well as our US market access cohort on this call. Feel free to queue up your questions either using the QA function at the bottom of your screen or the chat, or you can raise a hand later as we go into the Q&A. So today's topic, as I said, is all about fundraising, term sheets, and deal structuring. We'll touch on the current investment climate in general, but we'll talk more specifically about essential elements of startup fundraising and understanding term sheets and what to look out for as you're negotiating those, closing your upcoming rounds. So let me turn to our panelists and ask Joseph and Daniel each to briefly introduce themselves, tell us about your firm, the stages in which you typically invest, and if you have any geographical restrictions, or if there's any particular clinical focus of your company. So maybe let me begin with Joseph.
All right, thanks, Frederick, and thanks everyone for being here today. So my name's Joseph. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Verge Health Tech Fund. Personally, I started my life in programming, then became a scientist working on new cancer-killing viruses and imaging technologies, then became an accidental medical device entrepreneur. So I've kind of been in your shoes as well before moving into management consulting, angel investing, and professionalizing that angel investing through Verge, which is here today and has been around for 7.5 years. So basically, our firm, we invest globally in impactful healthcare technologies. That is usually in the form of diagnostics monitoring or health IT platforms. We tend to invest anywhere from the first check to Series A, with our sweet spot being at the seed. Our ticket sizes are between 500K to 1.5 million. We have no geographic preference or restriction. Although you do kind of see a little bit of biases based on where we're located or where our networks are most trusted. In terms of specific clinical areas, we tend to focus more on non-communicable diseases as opposed to infectious diseases, and we don't really touch accidents or trauma.
Understood. Very helpful, Joseph. And you're, of course, based here in Singapore, but I know you have a team in Europe as well.
We do, and we have folks in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Philippines as well. So we do have network in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Frederick. My name is Daniel Teo. I'm managing partner for Honeywell Lake Ventures. We are a Palo Alto, California-based medical device fund, and our investment focus is particularly for now in fund number 3 is currently in the areas of cardiology, neurology, and surgical oncology. You may ask why these 3 areas. There's a very simple reason. We did a survey of our LPs and potential investors and asked them, what are your 3 major health concerns? 3 things that worry you the most. And consistently they came back. It was about the heart, about the brain, and about cancer. And so those are the areas that we're going to be focusing on in Fund 3. We are a relatively new firm as venture capital goes. We were founded in 2020. In fact, we launched at JP Morgan in 2020. And as I said, currently in Fund 3. Our check sizes are typically around from about $500,000 to about $5 million. And depending on the size of the round, that places us usually in a Series A, Series B territory. Although we don't want to kind of limit that. A lot of it depends on how advanced and how much work the founders have already done. And we don't have any mandate that restricts us from investing outside of the US. Although just for practical reasons, so far all of our investments have been in the US. But there's nothing to stop us from investing in Europe, in Asia. In fact, we've been very active in both continents over the past couple of years. We have looked at a number of projects. We just haven't pulled the trigger there yet.
Understood. That's very helpful, Daniel. And of course, there's some of our cohort companies on the webinar today. We had the pleasure of meeting you in person at the summit in Mountain View just a few weeks ago. And we will come back to the point of non-US companies working with investors in the US. I know all of your investees currently, your portfolio companies are in the US. But the fact that you look at companies based elsewhere, be interesting to understand what some of those criteria are and what it would take for you to invest in non-US startups. Before we go into the details of the mechanics of fundraising and the details of term sheets and so on, just a sort of an initial macro level question about the current MedTech and health tech investment climate. And Joseph, I'll turn to you maybe first on this. What are you seeing? What are some of the year-on-year changes? Are the number of deals up or down? Are valuations up or down? What's been the impact of the new US administration? I know we can do a whole separate webinar on this topic, but if I'll ask you to be relatively brief, would love to have your thoughts on this.
Okay, so I'm going to be the sacrificial lamb here, and Daniel, you can be a good cop here. I think it's unfortunately been pretty terrible. There's this protracted downturn that has been going in the same direction since 2021, kind of like the peak of the COVID bubble, and I don't think we've quite recovered to what was happening before. And you do see, unfortunately, whenever you do have a bear market, you kind of have a flight to safety, and the flight to safety for most investors is the US, basically. And I think what's keeping Europe afloat is the generous, non-dilutive financing environment that exists. And, I wish there were kind of better things to say. I do think actually there is a silver lining in that, at least on the health tech and more digital side of things, you are starting to see companies generate enough evidence that you are getting, governments and payers a little bit more interested in paying for these things, and that is giving more of an investment case for these sorts of companies. But it has been a rough few years, So, not really painting the rosiest of picture here. That being said, I think for folks like us, it's a really good time to get involved and invest more in this space.
Yeah, there's been a bit of a reset of valuations, of course, since 2021, and you're not seeing valuations really picking up. So
I think it depends on stage, Frederick. I think
Yeah.
seed valuations have been relatively resilient. I think it's everything that comes after it
Good point.
And I think with the seed dynamic, you might even see in some cases valuations going up because, again, it's a flight to quality. So if before you would only, before, if you say funded 100 deals, now you'd be funding 25 deals, but you still have the same number of investors that are going to go after those 25 versus 100. So that's
Right.
and I think that's what has been keeping the seed valuations more or less stable and resilient. And I think there's a certain floor by which the founders are like, look, if I'm going to give up half my company at a, 3 or 5 million valuation, why did I quit my job? Why am I doing this? It'd be better off to just, work a little bit longer and bootstrap this myself.
Makes sense. Thanks for that perspective, Joseph. Daniel, what are you seeing through a US lens?
I think I would very much echo what Joseph has said. I think although I don't have any absolute numbers here, but I think we're seeing a compression of multiples across the board since the height of the COVID period. Both not just in private equities, but also in listed equities. If you do take a look at the PE ratios of all of the listed companies, they've come down since COVID. So, investors are becoming more knowledgeable and becoming more selective. I think Joseph talked about flight to quality. That's absolutely the case. There is still a lot of money out there to invest that's waiting for a good and right opportunity to invest. And there will always be funding for the best cases, the best deals, the best companies. It's just that you need to be able to rise above all of the other companies, right? You need to be able to rear your head against the crowd here. The good news is that we're also seeing better quality companies coming out, companies getting better prepared, thanks to programs like MedTech Innovator. I think both Joseph and I have been judges at the MedTech Innovator pitch programs, and I think you would agree with me. I think that the quality of the companies that are presenting have improved considerably over the last couple of years. So they're all better prepared. They all know what needs to be done and are getting the job done. So in that sense, they're making things a lot easier for investors to pick the winners too.
Great feedback, Daniel.
And of course, the good news for this group here, this cohort here, is that you are already shortlisted from hundreds of other companies. So you're ahead in the game, so to speak.
I was just going to say that. Thanks for that, Daniel. So kudos to the 30 companies that are on the webinar today. You've been selected in part from the reviews and evaluations of both Joseph and Daniel throughout the last 6 months or so, and certainly stand above the rest that we've seen this year. So thanks for that. Excellent. Well, let's go into some of the details now of fundraising. I think what would be interesting to maybe start with is I'll turn to Joseph first here, is what to you makes a compelling investment? Maybe you can make a reference, an example to a recent investment that you've made, but what makes a company really stand out for you as a target portfolio company?
Yeah, I guess it's three questions, and we always ask the same three questions. Is this a good opportunity? Is this a good company? And is this a good deal? And within opportunity, you've got breadth times depth. Is this a big enough problem? And is it a serious enough problem that people are going to want to change the way they practice medicine, or want to introduce an innovation, or want to pay for it? And from a societal perspective, because I guess we're a little bit strange in that we also look for kind of impact. Well, not kind of, definitely impact. How many people is this going to help? And what's that delta between where they were before this innovation and where they are afterwards? So we kind of look at that as well. Now, is this a good company can mean a lot of things, but the very first question is this a good team? And what does team mean? It means, clinical, technical, and commercial expertise and experience. If one of those things are missing, is there a path to complete that? And is the team coachable, understanding why they're doing this and the motivations? Because this is really hard. Going into medtech is probably one of the hardest things you can possibly do as an entrepreneur. So, kudos to you all on the call today for, choosing the higher difficulty setting on life. And so that's really important to understand the motivations and the founder product or founder solution fit to this. Of course, there is, governance, there is, the competitiveness of the product, the roadmap, the IP, all those things that, everyone tells you to look out for. And then finally, is this a good deal? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of whether we're impact or not impact, we're still capitalists, and we need to have a risk-adjusted return that our own stakeholders expect us to reach or surpass. And sometimes the math is just fundamentally incompatible with what the founders are looking for in terms of a deal. And we have to say, sorry, but no, thank you. You need another kind of investor. Venture capital is the most expensive kind of capital there is. So unless you're prepared to take on the responsibility and pressures of that, you really want to start thinking about other kinds of financial instruments, or financial investors out there, or non-financial investors are even better, because then they're not going to pressure you so much on the returns. Sorry, I went overly verbose there, and I probably missed a few things as well.
No, that's really helpful, Joseph. Daniel, anything you want to add your perspective on this in terms of what makes a compelling investment?
Again, generally echo what Joseph has said. Want to expand on 2 points. One is Joseph talked about the opportunity in terms of breadth and depth. It's important to go after a large market, because that gives you room for mistakes and for competition. right? When you're operating in a large market, there's room for two, three, even four players in that field. And even if you make a mistake, you can still survive. In a small market, it's tough to do that. The other thing that we look for is a clear, validated clinical need, not imagined clinical need. And I stress that because very often we have seen companies where founders, think they know what the need is, but have not really gone out there to validate that in an objective, systematic way. And I think being able to do that gives investors a lot of confidence that this product is going to make a difference. So one of the examples, one of our early investments, MedTech, which is also an MTI alumni, I believe, has a ultrasound guided magnetic driven gastrostomy device that allows feeding tubes to be placed by any clinically trained staff. You don't have to be a surgeon. It can be done at the bedside instead of waiting for a GI surgeon to do this in a surgical suite. So the obvious benefit to a hospital system is that A, you don't need a surgery suite. You can do this by the bedside. Two, anybody could do it as long as they're trained. You don't need a surgeon to do this. And that democratizes this whole procedure, and patients can go home a lot earlier. So those are some of the things that we would look for.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Daniel. And maybe staying with you, Daniel, now, your thoughts on maybe, and this is a question we get fairly often from startups. What are some of the key milestones typically that drive value? And where should a medtech company be, say, when they get to a Series A? In terms, you spoke about clinical evidence,
Yeah.
we can talk about regulatory milestones, reimbursement milestones. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think some people think, contrary to what some people think, institutional investors, which typically appear around Series A, they do not invest on faith. They invest on data. And so having some kind of data is important. Now, it's not good enough to say, hey, I've got this product, I've got this device, and I'm now ready, waiting for a Series A investment to go build this and test this. Investors want to know that you've already done some validation work even then, before then, to give us the confidence that when it is tested, it's going to actually have a better than even chance of passing these tests, right? Otherwise, it's going to be a long road to VNV, to FDA approval, and all of that. So you need some kind of early data, not necessarily clinical trials, but even bench test data to show that this device works, is efficacious, works as it's intended, and it's more likely than not able to outperform the standard of care and the competitive field out there. Those are the things that we will be looking for.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. And Joseph, from your perspective, key milestones that have a step change impact potentially on valuation?
Yeah, I mean, when we tend to invest, and sorry, I gave 0 examples in my previous
That's
answer.
okay. You're welcome to do that now.
Yeah, so we basically don't like to take scientific risk, but we can take technical, regulatory, commercial risk. So, there's a recent company that we just invested. They're still kind of in stealth mode. We're not going to announce the name yet, but they're doing something in the MRI space. And, we were very comfortable that the science has been proven out, and it was really a function of in this case, one of the components of it is an inexpensive calibration phantom, and seeing that is, that is possible to scale up with the right equipment. What's the actual materials that go into it? What's the manufacturing process look like? And that basically looks all in the realm of the feasible. Maybe another one, MedTech Innovator alumnus, Endiatics, when we first invested in them or started to meet them, the video resolution was, and sorry, this is a robot pill capsule that swims under its own power. I mean, the first version was called Poolbot. So it was actually literally the size of this and swam in the pool. And then every successive generation, they shrunk it down until it reached a size of 10 millimeters, which was a little bit too small. And some of the, electronics weren't quite ready for prime time. So they settled on a 12, 13 millimeter form factor, which is still very swallowable. and very usable. But when we first invested, the navigation didn't quite work. There was power issues, signal issues, resolution was very low, and the framework was also very low. But all these you could see there was a path to incremental improvement and feasibility. There was no science risk here. It was just engineering. And so we were very comfortable with that. So I do think that the milestone inflection points vary from company to company, depending on what you do. But generally, it's, the basal is the lab experiment, then there's the functional prototype, then there is something that is design freeze, ready to go into trials, then there's the result of the first trials if needed, or skip straight to FDA 510(k) if you're able to do that. And those are some of the key inflection points. And afterwards, is anyone going to pay for it? That's kind of another one. And of course, there are value inflection points when an investor comes in and says, "Hey, I like what you're doing. Let me give you a check." And that can happen in any course or any period during this journey, because what may be my value inflection points may be some other investors' ground truth, or they may have some value inflection points that we don't consider, especially if they're strategic. And I think one thing that MTI is doing very well, and sorry, I shouldn't be plugging the program even further because we've all drunk the Kool-Aid here, but the connections to the strategic corporates, they're able to see value in their product portfolio, or gaps in their product portfolio that you as startups may be able to fill that you don't know exists because they don't announce it publicly. Right. So there is an element of luck and surprise in all of this. And all we can say is give some general guidelines.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Joseph. And on the topic of strategics, just a quick question to both of you. I assume you, and I believe from knowing some of the investments you've done in the past, that you do readily co-invest with other VCs, other institutional investors, as well as strategics. The question again we get fairly often is, there a risk on the part of the startup by taking money from a strategic too early on? Is that going to preclude them from future deals? Is partnering with Medtronic at a seed stage, is that going to make it difficult to have a conversation with Stryker when you're at Series B? Daniel, maybe I'll turn to you first on that. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I think the devil's in the details, right?
Yeah.
So, there's nothing wrong with a investment from a strategic. The question is how you do it and what are the terms. So strategics are a good validation tool from a VC's perspective. It's good to know that the strategic is interested because it validates the market, it validates the need. But we just need to make sure that their presence do not, as you said, become a barrier to healthy competitive bidding, either in future rounds or upon exit. So as long as you're able to do that and are careful with the terms, I think it should be fine. You don't want a strategic to dominate your cap table. And very few strategics want that anyway.
Right.
There are only a couple of companies that I know that have a habit of trying to dominate the cap table, but most of them don't. And in fact, some of them are even welcoming of other strategics co-investing with them as well. So, yeah.
Yeah,
you'll find that it's a lot more collaborative the earlier you are in the cycle, because no one knows if this thing's actually going to work, and no one knows what their own strategy is going to be by the time this product is ready. And I think if you had perfect clarity on your strategy at such an early stage, they would just go and buy it. Why should they invest? Why would they wait? Why would they just pay more for it? If they know it's a perfect fit from day one, you can buy it on the cheap, like 10, 20 million bucks, done.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, I think a rule of thumb is, don't let the strategic lead the round.
Good advice. Good advice. Thank you for that. Daniel, I wanted to talk to you briefly about Asian medtech startups raising capital in the US, something that we talked about at the summit. There are a number of Asian medtech startups that we come across that are looking to raise larger, later rounds in the US. They can raise money in Asia Pacific up to a point, but for a sizable Series B, they believe they need to turn to the US. what should a company thinking of raising capital, company that's based outside of the US, what should they think about when they turn to US investors, and in terms of just increasing their odds of getting capital from US investors?
Sure. I think there are two things that can help them improve their odds. First is to kind of explore and understand if your product or your company has a US nexus, right? If there's some kind of connection, that if there's a reason for you to be even in the US in the first place. The reason is because there are some US funds, for instance, that do not invest in companies without a US nexus. So if you're not planning to establish a market in the US, if your product is intended for the third world economies, there's some funds that just absolutely won't even touch you,
Yeah.
right? So that reduces the number of potential investors you can go to. The other one, of course, is they want to, if you're going to the US, they'll be asking, why are you coming here and not raising money in Asia, for instance, where you are better known and where you're able to explain, and there are people who understand the ecosystem in Asia or elsewhere are much better. So the fact that you want to go to the US, you need to find some nexus, some reason why they should be interested. Having done that, I think it's important to understand or develop some understanding of the complexity of the US ecosystem in the medical device market. The whole ecosystem is complex, it's fragmented, it's very different. There are many different systems. If you're in insurance, for instance, just understanding how insurance works, there's a HMO, PPO, IDNs and all of that. I mean, there are so many different forms and organizations in which medical practice is being offered, medical services are being offered. So it's important to understand the complexity of that ecosystem, the decision-making processes within each one of those systems, because they can be different. There are some hospitals where the physicians are employees, and there are others where the physicians are independent contractors, and the decision-making process will be very different in those. So you don't have to be an expert, but you do need to at least recognize the complexity of that and be willing to be open to advise and help, because after all, investors are not just investing money into the company, they want to be in a position to help you. And that's what precisely a US-based investor is able to do.
Yeah, good point. Thanks for that. And again, it's a topic we can talk a whole lot more about, but let's leave it at that for now. Thank you, Daniel. Just a reminder to those of you who are on the call here, we do take your questions. Feel free to queue them up using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And just as a reminder, if you for the 30 companies that are on the call, we did reach out to you, we did survey you, we asked for your feedback on topics and pain points for these webinars. And some of the questions I'm asking now are questions that were raised by our cohort companies. So there are a couple of questions about debt financing, and I don't want to digress here too much, but maybe if I turn to Joseph, what are some of your thoughts on the role of debt financing for an early stage company, and what might that sort of arrangement look like?
Yeah, generally, I'm not a fan for early stage companies because debt is debt. They need to be paid back. It's not like equity where, you can only lose 1x of your money, but you can make 100 times upside. The debtors, they need a, guaranteed return. They need their money back, and they're not going to have any sort of compassion towards you if you struggle to pay some of that back. They will get their money back one way or another. So unless you are generating some sort of cash flow or very close to it, where basically you need the debt financing to bridge a contract that's coming in for, say, $1 million, don't go anywhere near it. But the moment you are making money, it's a wonderful way to non-dilutively grow your business.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Thanks for that. Another question, I'll turn to Daniel here, perhaps on this one. again, from one of our startups. One of them wrote in and said, one of our weaknesses is that we have a very fragmented cap table. How big an issue is that for an early stage company if they have 30, 40 individuals and how can a messy cap table be optimized? And is that a red flag for you?
It absolutely is. I mean, let's recognize what are the risks to a fragmented cap table. Firstly, it's an administrative burden, just to communicate with so many different stakeholders. When you need to make a decision as a shareholder, when you need a shareholder vote, the managing of that process, or if there is a board election, is just a administrative nightmare. Now, on top of that, there are also legal exposures because every single investor could be a potential litigant, right, in an action further down. So you want to try and keep things simple and keep things moving. Now, there are a couple of solutions you can, for a startup to clean up your cap table. You can try and do a share buyback, take out some of, and usually, a fragmented cap table I've seen tends to happen when a company has a relatively longer history. So there are many rounds of investors coming in, and they've never really gotten to the institutional round. They have a lot of pre-seed and seed rounds, and that's how you get that many number of investors on your cap table. So you can solve it by doing a share buyback, for instance, buy back some of your shares. You can move your individual investors into a SPV or holding entity, of course, with their consent. Or you can try and procure a proxy voting agreement, that they basically they will keep their economic interests, but surrender their voting rights to a proxy, usually the founder or the CEO. Or if there's a new investor coming in or an existing investor who is interested in acquiring a larger stake in the company, then potentially they may be interested in doing a buyout. But absolutely, cleaning up your cap table will be very important, because when it comes to an exit, right, you want to be able to make a quick decision. And the less shareholders you have, the less stakeholders you have, the easier that conversation.
Makes sense. And we did actually have a question here about whether it would make sense to set up an SPV for smaller investors below a certain threshold, and that was one of the examples, of course, you brought up. Joseph, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, usually, but not always, a fragmented cap table also comes with severe founder dilution. Because the way you ended up there is you had to keep going out to the market and kind of, nibbling on hors d'oeuvres instead of having a main course for the entirety of your journey. And when a founder drops below a certain percentage, they're no longer the entrepreneur, they're an employee. And you're reporting to 50 bosses, and how does that work? So I think that you have a misalignment of incentives, and ultimately you are setting yourself up for failure. So what we and other investors sometimes do with this is they end up restructuring the cap table. So not just, buyouts or proxy votes or putting things in an SPV, but also creating what's called like a recap, where you're recapitalizing the company and you are actually creating a very large new pool of shares to be redistributed to the founders and key employees, as well as leaving some room for future founder or employee ownership. And, those are not pleasant conversations to have, especially when the investors are not professional investors, which is also usually how we ended up getting into this situation to begin with. So there's a lot of education and heavy lifting. And what we have seen some investors do, and again, I'm being very kind of non-specific here on purpose. They wait, and we don't do this, by the way. Just to be clear, we don't like drama. They basically string the company along until they're almost dead, and then the investors have a choice. Does your value go to zero? Or does it go to something?
Very helpful, and I think that's probably a good segue for us to go into some of the specific term sheet terms. You spoke about the Joseph, about the risk of founders becoming employees, and what percentage of ownership does a VC typically want to see executive founders retain to make sure that there is that engagement and an incentive? Is there a percentage?
There's no hard and fast rule. I think it depends company to company, stage by stage. But okay, I'm going to contradict myself and say that if it's the first round of capital, we basically want to see it all there. If it's
Right.
I guess, post angel round, we'd still like to see something like 80% ownership, maybe more. Again, more is better. Seed stage, again, 65 to 85%, I think is not too unreasonable. And then you would, I guess, expect dilution of 20% or so every successive round after that. And I think, when it is a large enough enterprise, when they are making cash flows, when it's not just about the two driving personalities or three driving personalities in the company, it's all right for founders to have a minority at that point, like below 50%. It's not, an absolute deal killer, but to the point when they're still irreplaceable, you definitely want them in control of the ship. Because what are you? Are you going to run the company as an
Mm.
investor? You know, and what seasoned executive is going to want to run into a how should I say, a poorly paid exercise in drama?
Yeah, great point. Daniel, anything you want to add to that?
No, nothing to add. I agree with Joseph.
Okay. Yeah. That's a great point. So, as we started talking about term sheets, one of the questions I did want to ask of both of you, if you could share if there are maybe two or three critical but maybe not so obvious items in a term sheet that are easily overlooked by a startup, but that potentially could be critical for them down the road. What would some of those examples be? And maybe Daniel, I'll turn to you first here.
Um, well, I think one of the terms that are less readily sort of discussed and talked about are drag along rights, which are important for investors like VCs, because drag along rights essentially what it means is that if the number of shareholders that approve a sale of the company reaches a certain threshold, then the rest of the minorities who oppose the deal will be forced to drag into the deal, notwithstanding the fact that they've objected to it.
Mm.
And for a larger institutional investor, this is important to a company, to an investment, because when we're trying to sell this company to Medtronic, for instance, Medtronic's not interested in buying 60% of the startup. If they come in, they want 100% of the
Right.
equity. And so having these minorities hold out there is going to be a problem. And so understanding how drag along rights work, I think, is often not considered, but I think it's important. And so you need to be prepared for that. I think that's one of those. The others, the reps and warranty section in the term sheet is often the most boring ones, but they're also possibly the most important ones as well, because every one of those bullet points can be the basis for a legal action,
Mm.
right? And so it's important for you and your lawyers, and if you've got a good legal team, they will do most of the heavy lifting for you. But it's also important as a founder to understand what each one of those reps and warranties mean. What are you actually representing and warrantying? Because if you do that wrong, or if you misrepresent, that again could be a basis for a legal action later on. Similarly, covenants. I've seen founders who don't pay a whole lot of attention to the covenant section of these agreements. But it's important because those are promises that you're making to your investors and your stakeholders. And it's important to not to be in breach of those covenants, because again, they could put your whole company or your shareholding at risk there as well.
Great
Yeah,
points. Joseph, please.
yeah. I tend to be more wary of term sheets that are short, because they will leave a lot of wiggle room in the definitive agreements themselves. And there is this concept of negotiation in good faith in the US, which is not replicated across other jurisdictions. So, the investor has full legal right to almost do a retrade in certain jurisdictions based on the lack of specificity within the term sheet. And let's also keep in mind that aside from a few key clauses, the term sheet is actually a non-binding document. So, in places where you don't have good faith negotiations, well, you should be questioning whether you actually want to conclude the deal or not. But there may be a lot of unpleasant surprises that live off the term sheet. Within the term sheet itself, the difference between non-participating and participating liquidation preferences are massive. And so, and the difference between the two is 4 characters and easy to overlook if you're not, proficient in the arts. So participating liquidation preferences are you get your liq prefs first, and then you get to double dip by pro rata distribution of whatever's left behind. Non-participating is either or. So you either take your liq pref or you distribute. And within the liquidation preferences themselves, in times of difficulties, those may change from one to something else. And the moment it changes from one to something else, it means that variable is negotiable. So every subsequent investor, it's never going to go down from there, right? I've never ever seen someone go from, seed investor wants a 2x, and then the Series A wants a 1x liquidation preference. It'll go to 2, 2.5, 3, 4, and before you know it,
There's
you may
nothing
sell your
left for you.
Yeah, there's nothing left for you as a founder, or nothing left for the earlier investors either. So, we're aligned in that we don't really want to change that number to anything more than 1. Although I do suspect that that's not a non-obvious one, but maybe the participating, non-participating is. With respect to the covenants and the warrants and reps, fully agree with what Daniel says. And so, when in doubt, disclose. So make sure that you have a very comprehensive disclosure schedule at the start, and then get the investor to sign off on it, because every disclosure is one less thing they can come back and sue you about later. And, one thing that is clear is the US is far more litigious than other territories. And, have now seen 2 companies get involved in some sort of legal dispute. Both of them are involving the US. We've invested globally. I think, now personally, I've got almost 40 deals that I've seen, and 100% of any sort of legal stuff has been American. I've not seen anywhere else in the world do this. Not saying that doesn't happen, but, I've got a reasonable sample set. So, the threat is real here. Other things, be careful of what your investor and board can block you on. And you would be surprised sometimes the petty reasons of why you may have the company's growth blocked, and or some sort of subsequent investor. And it's very difficult to prove, the pettiness behind that reason without, seriously delaying or interfering with your company's progress. It's just something you don't want to go through. So I do think that if there are these sort of blocking things that you can't negotiate around, what you can negotiate in is a deadlock provision. And I've seen almost no deadlock provisions in definitive agreements or term sheets. So there has to be a recourse. If you're stuck, there has to be a recourse. Otherwise, it's going to be really, really painful.
Great advice. And of course, we can talk much more about this. We will share the contact details, both of Joseph and Daniel, after the call, and with the cohort companies, if anyone has any follow-on questions. Turning to a few other questions from our startups here. There's one here about the approach to structure a bridge round. And maybe Daniel, I'll turn to you on this one. What are your recommendations in terms of structuring a bridge round and things to look out for?
Well, a bridge round is a debt instrument, right? So, well, in most cases, they're convertible debt. So as Joseph said earlier on, it's vitally important for you to have a clear purpose and clear milestones for that bridge. What is that for? It should be a very limited purpose. It's not just to raise money for the company to keep it going, right? You need clear milestones. What are you going to achieve with that bridge that will then enable or improve your chances of raising an equity round subsequently? If you don't have that, then it's a recipe for disaster because you're going to be going from one bridge round to another, and it's going to be increasingly expensive and painful for you as a founder. So being very clear about what milestones you want to reach and can reach with your bridge round. And besides, your credibility is at stake as well. If you don't meet those milestones and you're forced to go to a second bridge and a third bridge, um, the equity investors are going to take a look at that and say, why would I invest in a CEO that hasn't been able to keep his promises?
Yeah, makes sense. And we have a related question here about convertible notes. What are your general views on convertible notes, Daniel? Sitting with you.
I think it's the same thing. Convertible notes have their place, but again, it has to be very specific, time limited. It's not meant to last forever, right? And so it is to bridge you to a proper equity round, and you want to make sure that you're able to meet those milestones and achieve the milestones that will then enable you to raise the equity round. Because if you don't, then those convertible notes can be a stone around your neck, so to speak. It will drown you.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. Thanks for that. Joseph, are there any terms typically for Verge Health Tech that are completely non-negotiable when you make investments that you want to flag here?
Yeah, information reporting rights. And also being an impact fund, we do also need the companies to report on what and who they've actually reached or how they've actually, improved outcomes. We understand that the early stages, that's going to be a zero answer, but that answer still has to be there. So, venture thrives on information asymmetry. And if we don't have information, how are we going to generate alpha? I think it's really, really important to understand how the company is going, how it's doing, both from a strategic and financial perspective. So that's a non-negotiable point. That's basically the number one thing that we are concerned about, that may be a little bit more strict than other early stage investors.
And you would put that in the term sheet?
Oh yeah, we absolutely do. We even we even show links to our submission forms in the term sheet. Yeah, it's really, really important to us, and it's important to our stakeholders.
Understood. Daniel, non-negotiable terms from your perspective.
Well, I suppose we don't have anything that's non-negotiable, well, that will make it to a term sheet, but we have non-negotiable expectations, which is the
Let's go with those. That's helpful.
Absolute, unadulterated commitment from the founders.
Yeah.
That's what we would expect. That's the basis for our investment. And if the founders are not demonstrating that, then that's a no deal. That's a deal breaker.
Very, very helpful. Very helpful. Now we have a number of questions here from our cohort companies that are on the line. So let me touch on a couple of these. I think it'd be interesting. So let's say we have, bear with me for a second. Is there any chart or suggested chart as per the funding stage and what the cap table should look like? We spoke about cap tables earlier. I know that there are tools like Carta and other things. Any thoughts that you want to share on this particular point?
Well, Carter is particularly good because I think they are looking after 80 to 90% of cap tables in the US. So if you want to know what normal looks like for each stage and variances, that's a pretty good reference point. And I think any deviations should be logical and explainable. And I think we've previously discussed what are appropriate founder ownership thresholds. I think in any case, you don't want any shareholder to have disproportionate say. And there are also certain tax and legal implications of somebody owning too much. You may be considered a subsidiary, which is different than, minority investment. There are different, I guess, taxation implications as well. In some jurisdictions, that number is 10%, in others is 20, in others is 25, in others it's 50. And I can't for the life of me remember which country is which, but so you just have to be kind of careful around those thresholds. I know with us, our American investors are not supposed to have more than 10%.
Interesting. Daniel, any thoughts from you on this?
No, I've got nothing to add on this piece here.
Okay. Um, one final question before I ask you to give some general tips and advice. If there is a successful exit that you'd like to share with that you can share with the audience, and what made it particularly successful, I think that's because we've spoken a lot about things to watch out for, and it would be good to end on a positive note if you guys don't mind. A particular successful exit and something that's gone really well. And maybe Daniel, I'll start with you.
Well, so recognizing that we're a relatively new, young fund, 6 years in the making, or 5 years in the making, we are hopefully getting our first exit. It will be an IPO, but I don't want to jinx it by saying too much about it.
Okay.
But I would say look out for announcements within the next 30 days.
Excellent. That's very imminent. Fingers crossed.
Yeah,
And
congratulations in advance. I mean, congratulations for even getting to this stage. We're in a similar boat with one of our companies. They will be listing. It's scheduled for the first week of October. I think should that go through, it will be monumental for our industry because it's going to be a first in a few aspects. I don't want to go into details right now to not jinx it, similar to Daniel.
Okay.
It's funny. We're all supposed to be data driven, and look how superstitious we're both being.
Right.
But there is one exit, and this is to kind of show that it's not always an IPO or an M&A, but I had a secondary transaction that liquidated a portion of my holdings, and I say my because this is pre-Verge, and it took 7 years to do, at 17 times, which is not bad at all. So basically, I make 5x my principal. Everything that's remainder in there is pure upside, is pure profit. Even if it goes to zero, I made 5x my principal, and 17x the actual share on share value is pretty cool. But it didn't happen because the company was bought. It just happened because there was a really big investor that came in, and there wasn't room for that big investor to accumulate the ownership percentage they wanted to accumulate without taking out some previous investors. And hindsight will say whether that was the right call for me personally or not. Should I have sold 100% of it? Should I have sold less? Was this the right amount? I think a general rule of thumb on secondaries is whenever given the opportunity to take money off the table, take money off the table. And general rule of thumb is if you can recover your principal on it or some small multiple of it, I think it's all right. But again, everything's case by case. And there's this idea of opportunity. Sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but there's an idea of opportunity cost, and there's an internal rate of return that a venture capitalist needs to make. So then the question, and let's say that IRR is 35%, will I make 35% holding on to this position where I've known this company for the past 7 to 10 years? Or will I make that 35% taking that money off the table and putting it somewhere else? So those are some of the internal questions you kind of have to ask yourself when given such opportunities. Other exits, I wouldn't say they were nearly as spectacular. There's been a lot of change of control type exits where you had a safe note, someone came around and bought the company, and well, okay, you get your money back with a little bit of interest or a little bit of a kicker. And that sometimes happens when you have early acquisitions.
Great. Well, thanks for that. It's interesting that both of you have imminent exits that both are IPOs, when we typically say that ours is an industry where
Yeah.
exits are always trade sales, but obviously that's not always the case. So
Well, I think we might be a little selective as well because the IPOs are always exciting. We do have also some, exploratory M&A discussions. One M&A discussion that is almost, I think, done. It's down to 1 point.
okay,
But you know, the IPO market has been so terrible for the past few years. To start seeing this come alive again, that's really exciting. That's,
absolutely.
everyone's like ringing the bell, everyone's
Right.
celebrating. You see the stock ticker, you say, "Oh, now they're in the big leagues." So
Yeah.
that's so I think there's a little bit of excitement there. And plus an M&A, an M&A may come out of nowhere, right?
Right.
And so you may not know that an M&A is imminent, and then 2 weeks later, your company might be sold, right?
Right.
Whereas an IPO, you see it coming like a year away,
Yeah.
and that's maybe why those tend to be more top of the mind in conversations.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Gentlemen, we're almost at the top of the hour. Thank you both so much for being part of this. Before we move into Q&A, I wanted just to ask for some final parting words, tips, recommendations, any final advice to our cohort companies before we move into our Q&A section. And Daniel, let me turn to you first.
Well, first, I want to congratulate all of the founders and executive team members who are on this call today. The fact that you have been selected, shortlisted, shows you have come a long way. And what you do is important, whether is it saving lives, improving the quality of life of your patients. This is important work you do, and I encourage you to persevere in that quest. And the only advice I would give is, take all of the best advice around you. Never stop asking questions, never stop seeking help. The community is generally, at least at the startup stage, they're generally very forgiving and generally very willing to help. All of the mentors and all of the judges in MedTech Innovator are available and accessible to you. Exploit them to the fullest. That would be my advice.
Great advice. Thank you for that, Daniel. Joseph.
Oh, it's hard to follow that one. I think that was excellent advice. So I do echo all the congratulatory messages and sentiments that Daniel shared. I think on the point of advice, always, I mean, it's good to seek advice, but always qualify that advice with the motivations and experience of the person giving that advice to you. I think that's super important. I guess enjoy the journey because and find things to enjoy about the journey. Because if it's just really about the end result and you hate the journey, then and if the end result is not guaranteed, where does that leave you if things don't work, right? So you have to enjoy the journey.
I think that's really good advice, and I don't think I've heard that before. So thank you for that, Joseph. And Daniel, Joseph, thanks again to both